Those who have a longer familiarity with spiritual science ought really to regard it as something that can have the most intense and energetic effects on human life. I have often said this, but it is an aspect of spiritual science so vital for our age that cannot be stated often enough. The science of the spirit is, after all, a kind of science, and as such it is in a process of development, remaining fragmentary as yet, and only partially proven. The form it can eventually assume is something we can see only the very first beginnings of at present. I am speaking here of the content of spiritual science, by means of which we can learn something about the nature of the human being, about our supersensible individuality, insofar as this also lives and exists beyond the boundaries of physical life marked by birth or conception and death. The science of the spirit can also teach us something about the evolution of the earth, and about the connections between this evolution and the human being. In other words, spiritual science can satisfy human thirst for knowledge in a more comprehensive way than empirical science. It can answer some of the inner questions which people have. But spiritual science has an importance beyond its content, and we can see this when we consider what we ourselves, our soul life, mood of soul, and frame of mind, can become if we occupy ourselves with the thoughts and ideas of spiritual science. It may also be the case, and this is true of course of every field of inquiry ever known to mankind, that insights drawn from sources of spiritual life and disseminated today in all good conscience may later be superseded as the science of the spirit itself makes further self-correcting advances, that some things will then appear in a different form. Then one or another aspect of the content of this science of the spirit might be different. But this developing content of ideas or thoughts will not alter its fundamental effect upon our inner mood and outlook. And this in turn relates very closely to certain basic traits of our current time. Today I wish to consider some of these fundamental characteristics of our age, especially as they concern the soul disposition of human beings. In doing so, I will adhere to the four most important human soul capacities already very familiar to us: to human sensory perception, to thinking by means of which we assimilate and integrate these external sensory impressions, to feeling, and to will. During waking life, our inner experience unfolds in perception, thinking, feeling, and will. Let us first take sensory perception. With an eye, EYE, of soul honed through spiritual science, we can observe a fundamental cultural characteristic of the human soul developing over the past 300 or 400 years in countries we are concerned with now. This is not intended as any kind of criticism, but only as a description. Even a superficial reflection will show that the capacity for sensory perception in human beings, thus the soul's immediate relationship with the surrounding world, has increasingly come to require ever more vivid, intense, and absorbing stimulus to satisfy the senses. The older members of the audience might like to reflect on their youth and compare what they experienced then with current conditions. It is still more striking the further back in time one goes. The urge for sensational stimulus has grown very markedly and become predominant. And this is because people today need strong and very rapidly changing sensory impressions in order to be excited and engaged by their surroundings. They want to be titillated and fascinated. A sensational quality has become very widely predominant, and this is connected with something highly significant. The predominance of a need for sensory stimulus also modifies the strength and energy of the human eye, capital. Only spiritual science can enable us to understand why this is so, since it can tell us what external perception really is. If you study philosophy, you will find most effort of all expended on the nature of external perception, or sentience, as it is also called. The most diverse theories have been formulated to explain what sentience or perception are in the context of the human corporeality and psyche. There is no need for me to expound on all this here, but I do need to explain the position of spiritual science in relation to this question. On previous occasions, also here in Berlin in a public lecture, I have suggested that science in the 19th century and into our own time achieved magnificent things, in particular as regards our understanding of the external world perceived by our senses. And yet it conceives of human evolution, in particular, in far too linear a way, and in far too simple terms. Its hypothesis is simply that there were once lower animals, then higher ones, then higher still, and from these the human being ultimately developed as highest animal. Yet human evolution just isn't that simple. There are various ways in which we can conceive of the human being, and to us, as I have often said, his outer bodily form must appear as the image of cosmic divine being. We can also conceive of him in scientific terms now as subdivided into three parts: the head or sensory part, which, since the chief senses are located in the head, we can sum up generally as the head system, though it is not a precise term. Then the trunk system, and thirdly the system of extremities or limbs. Of these three parts of the human being, really only the trunk, the heart and lung system, is formed as modern science conceives it. The head system is not actually involved in an advancing developmental process, but is, in a sense, retrograde, held back at an earlier stage. People have frequently told me that this is a difficult idea to grasp, and have asked me to explain it in easier terms. In fact, as I have pointed out in various occasions, the external scientific facts, if properly understood, though this is at odds with what certain modern scientists say, prove what I say to be true. Study the human eye, EYE, and compare it with the eyes of animals at a certain stage of evolution. You cannot say that the outer form of the human eye is more complex than that of an animal at a certain evolutionary stage. That is clearly not the case. There are animals that have more developed aspects of the inner eye than we do. They have structures for which there is no external physical parallel at all in us. For instance, the falciform process and other organs in the inner eye which are blood vessel modifications. The prolongation of these blood vessels sustains the intimate coherence between an animal's whole feeling life and its visual perceptions. The animal feels far more intensely in its eyes than we do. And we do not have these organs. The human eye is actually simpler, and therefore our evolution has not produced an advance on the animal eye as such, but has also returned it to an earlier stage. In the same way, one could demonstrate that the minutest aspects of the human head are retrograde, that our head has, quote, evolved backward, close quote, again compared with the rest of the forward-evolving human organism. Someone who thought this retrograde development of the human head was a difficult idea to grasp asked me if I could offer any clarifying points of reference here. I told him that we need only consider the following. In the evolutionary sequence of animals that concludes with the human being, the human embryo is distinctive in losing the hair coat possessed by animals at a certain stage of development. We do not have fur, but the head does have a hair covering. We can see, therefore, that our head returns in its development to the animal stage. And this is another indicator of its retrograde nature, though of course only a superficial external one. The inner indicators are much more eloquent of this fact. And I would ask you to consider the full scope of its significance. The very fact that the head's development becomes retrograde, so that evolution does not progress in a linear way here, but withdraws in the head, holds itself back, means that space is created for our soul spiritual development. The researchers who believe that human feeling and cognition result only from our physical organization do not properly understand their own science. They fail to see that our soul and spirit can only unfold because the physical organism does not thrive and flourish, but instead recedes or withdraws. It abates, comes to a standstill, makes space for the development of spirit and soul. Where we unfold spirit and soul to the greatest degree, physical development withdraws. We can inwardly perceive this if we have undergone soul spiritual development, and through inner self-observation, receive an answer to the question of what our ordinary thinking and perception is. What is the real nature of our ordinary waking life, infused by thinking and sensory perception? As far as the human head is concerned, sensory perception and thinking, and in fact waking life altogether, are a hunger. The distinctive nature of the inner balance of our human organization is that during waking life the head, or rather its inner organization, continually feels hunger compared with the rest of the body. Ascetics who seek enhancement of their soul and spirit have made use of this fact. They fast, let their whole body go hungry, because this hunger process, extended to the whole body, is meant to induce inner illumination of a kind. In fact, this is mistaken. The normal state is already for our head. In waking life, to be less nourished by inner processes than the rest of the organism. And only because of this can we be awake and alert and think. If our head is always hungry, while we are given up to this retrograde process in the head, whereas in sleep efforts are made to overcome this stasis, what do we actually perceive? The science of the spirit can teach us to distinguish two things here, which in reality are always combined and yet are two very different things. Firstly, mere waking life, and then our external sensory perceptions and our ordinary memory pictures. So, what is actually occurring as we hunger in our waking consciousness? On the one hand, we perceive the capital I from our previous incarnation. In mere waking, we perceive what we brought with us from the world of spirit, and what accompanied us as we entered life through birth or conception. This fills the space created by the withdrawal of our physical organism. And when we perceive external sensory objects, these objects take the place of the I we otherwise perceive when we receive no external impressions but are merely awake. In ordinary life, these two things are merged. We continually perceive external objects and are very rarely in a merely waking state. But into our outward-oriented psyche is mingled an inclination to perceive our past I, as well as to suppress it through external colors or tones. Perception of our past I alternates with suppression of it. For as soon as an external object impinges on us, it suppresses our tendency, our capacity to perceive the I from our former incarnation. This remains unconscious. We are unaware of it. Yet our sensory perception is really a battle between the object that exists before us in the present and the I of our previous incarnation. You may now start to realize what it means if we seek sensory stimulus by giving ourselves up to the external world. This will never strengthen, but only weaken us. And this is because we are in fact weakening what our strength really consists of, which is our I from a previous incarnation. It is clear, therefore, that a tendency to seek the sensational, literally, in the form of sensory stimulus, will produce a kind of weakness in human nature by weakening the I. And what occurs when we think or picture rather than perceiving sensory reality? Either our thoughts fall quiet, though this is less common nowadays, or they relate to particular external perceptions. When our thoughts fall quiet in waking life, then everything we experienced between our previous incarnation and the present one is active in us, in what can be active by virtue of space created within our organism. Thus, where sensory perceptions otherwise arise, the past incarnation acts. And where ideas otherwise arise, the life we underwent between death and rebirth becomes active in us. If we develop powerful thoughts out of ourselves, this means we are trying to elaborate them from what we brought with us from the period before our latest birth, out of something intrinsic to us. If, on the other hand, we only develop thoughts stimulated in us by our external surroundings, absorbed as pervasive soul content from without, we invariably weaken what we brought with us from the period between death and rebirth, that is, what our I consists of. The compulsive search for sensation weakens our present life. Spending lots of evenings at the pub, say, to avoid drawing as little as possible on our own resources, or the excitement of poker games or bingo or any other of the 1,000 little external stimuli people seek out to spice up their lives, is not a strengthening, but a weakening of the I. And this is basically due to a feeling that they are not strong enough to occupy themselves with something drawn from their own inner life. The science of the spirit can teach us why people today seek out sensation and stimulus. In general, we can diagnose this prevalent aspect of modern culture as a kind of narrow-mindedness. Please don't take offense at this. It is simply how things are nowadays, and applies equally to modern science or other fields. This narrow-mindedness is a major symptom of our culture today, and prevents people from searching in their own souls for the wealth available from their past life and from their pre-birth existence. They have no belief in such a thing, and it would be essential to acknowledge it, and to see that spiritual science could enable them to access it. With this in mind, let us for a moment consider how spiritual scientific ideas can affect the state and pattern of a person's soul. They certainly do not offer external stimulus or sensation, and definitely do not seek to do so. They do not captivate the senses through outer sensations, and many miss such stimulus. In relation to spiritual scientific matters, people have to reflect themselves, and are likely to fall asleep if they are unable to draw anything from their own inner resources. What spiritual science does in particular is to investigate mobility in the life of the psyche, to shake it awake. It endows us with a capacity to elaborate our own inner thoughts. It counters outward sensation, especially by enabling us to think a great deal about only very few sense impressions. There is no need to rush from one sensation to the next, but instead we can ponder greatly on all kinds of sensory impressions. Every simple phenomenon we encounter can become a riddle for us, Every small detail of life gives us much food for thought. And the thoughts and ideas which many people find too complex about Saturn, Sun, and Moon phases of evolution, about the different planetary embodiments of the Earth and so on, give our spirit mobility, and in a sense prevent narrow-mindedness. In this way, our science of the spirit works to counter a certain cultural predisposition, fights against bigotry and narrow-mindedness in the realm of perception and thinking. This accompanies, but is not the same as, the content we gain from spiritual science. It forms our soul, and this is of much importance. As regards the realm of human feelings, let us ask what trait appears in those who concern themselves with spiritual science, compared to those who wish to have nothing to do with it and reject it out of hand. In the latter, one finds lack of interest for the great concerns of the world. If we are to cultivate an interest in spiritual science, we need to broaden our interests beyond the things closest to hand. What do most people nowadays care about, some previous stage of the earth, before it became our earth? What do most people nowadays care about human culture before it developed into the modern age? This requires us to broaden the scope of our interests beyond immediate and familiar circumstances. Our age tends to confine our areas of interest to a very narrow realm. Forgive me if I state quite boldly, though I'm characterizing here, not criticizing, that our time tends toward the mean-spirited and Philistine. As more and more people succumb to this Philistine tendency, it will increasingly affect the public domain as well. One striking example of this can unsettle anyone with insight into current events. In the East, in Russia, is a people whose depths of soul are as yet undeveloped, still in a childlike state. But these underlying powers of soul should evolve in future, in the next, the sixth post-Atlantean era, to special heights, acquiring a spiritually active character. This is something one wishes to acknowledge and nurture. But this people, or a great majority of them, now labor under the scourge of Leninism. One can scarcely think of anything more grotesque than the coupling of this cultural monkey of the West, I don't mean the man himself, but what he propounds, with a prophetic culture of the East. No two things could possibly be more divergent in nature and yet be coupled together. Here we have the most grotesque expression of materialism, the essence of Philistinism, which Leninism is, the rejection of all broader cultural interests, and the imprisoning of these cultural interests in the narrowest possible Philistinism. And set against this a dynamic from the East that seeks to develop in these people something fundamentally anti-Philistine. We have to see this clearly, and there is nothing that can better help us do so than spiritual science. Spiritual science also counters Philistinism by appealing to broader, more generous human interests. You see, without interest in what connects us with the cosmos, surpassing the narrowest interests and pulsing into grandeur, one cannot become a spiritual scientist. In the realm of human feeling, therefore, the science of the spirit battles against the Philistinism and mean-spiritedness that inevitably emerge from materialism, just as in the domain of perception and thinking it battles against narrow-mindedness and bigotry. As for the realm of the will, we can observe remarkable things here too, if we have developed a little perception of life. Not materialism itself, but what is attendant on and associated with it develops something peculiar in the whole of human life. The will, of course, can only come to expression through the vehicle of corporeality, if it is to act on and affect the outer world. Our modern materialistic age leads people to be clumsy. They become clumsy in a whole host of ways, because in their earliest youth their bodily forces are enlisted in only a few very particular actions and directions. Strange to say, there are men who cannot even sew a button on their shirt, let alone do anything more complex. If we regard spiritual science as more than mere theory or doctrine and see the warmth at work in it, absorbing this warmth into our whole being, it enters the muscles, the pulse, and makes us more skillful. If we were able to introduce our children to a spiritual scientific way of thinking, we would see the benefits in their dexterity, in their ability to do things more easily. Their fingers would become more skillful. If we can make our ideas more mobile and flexible, this also gives more mobile expression to the will. In the realm of the will, therefore, the science of the spirit battles against the clumsiness threatening humanity, which, more than many imagine, is symptomatic of our age. Look around and see how many people are capable of doing anything outside the narrow remit of their profession. They have lost the knack for such things. And even in their work, they are more or less just adhering to customary actions. If you take someone who has become accustomed to the more or less mechanical procedures of his job and try to get him to do something different, you will see the very one-sided nature of modern culture. This cannot be remedied by external means, however, since our national economy tends toward specialism in everything. It would be pointless to try to fight this. But what we can do is energize people inwardly, so that from the center of their being they acquire more skillful impulses. To do this, they have to imbue themselves fully with awareness of the supersensible world, and above all, of the supersensible nature of the human being. We cannot properly understand sensory perception and thinking, even scientifically, if we do not know what I described earlier, that the human organism recedes to make place in the head so that our past life and the life between death and rebirth can stream into our organism. Scientific views about the human organism are, as I said, far too narrow. Only the human trunk can be conceived as narrowly as science regards it, but not the limb system. If we now consider our extremities, arms, hands, feet, and legs, though this system also continues inward, we can see its organization as being opposite to that of the head. Rather than retrograde development, we find excess development. Here, development shoots beyond what is otherwise normal, beyond what we actually need during life. This would become clear if people studied evolution very carefully. Let us take just the external limbs, the arms connected to the breasts as secondary reproductive organs, then the legs in connection with the primary sexual organs, and thus the extremities in physical connection with an aspect which already allows a person to look beyond himself, his own life, in physical terms. At their core, the organization of our extremities does not merely serve what infuses our individual human life, but goes beyond this. But goes beyond us. Thus our soul and spirit. The soul spiritual reality underlying our extremities goes beyond what serves human life between birth and death, works beyond death. Just as there is a physical connection in reproduction between the adult human organization, the center of its extremities, and what will become the child's, so spiritually, as imagination, we also possess in our arms and legs something that bears us to the gate of death. We can perceive this very clearly through imaginative perception. We bear, in the organization of our extremities, even anatomically, our soul spiritual future after death. A careful, diligent study of science will eventually mean that people no longer regard spiritual science as something unattainable. Instead of considering the human organism in a linear way, but by observing its reality, which is nonlinear, science itself will discover the need for a spiritual, scientific perspective. One thing that must be refuted in this process is the idea that all external sense impressions are of the same nature. This is a belief held not only by lay people nowadays, but also by clinical researchers in their anatomical studies. They regard the heart as just another organ like the head. This isn't true. Compared to the heart, the head is of a lower evolutionary order in its whole organization. But people cannot discern this, cannot observe properly. When people learn to observe correctly, science itself will give rise to a fundamental conviction of the spirit at work in the human being and passing through births and deaths. Arriving at this insight, people will then also start to pay heed to the soul and spirit in all culture, and will realize the importance of the battle against narrow-mindedness, Philistinism, and clumsiness. Alongside this, above all, they will learn to take account of the spirit in practical life. Nowadays, a physicist encounters no objections when speaking of positive and negative electricity, positive and negative magnetism, whereas people feel affronted if the spiritual scientist talks of two currents in the human soul, the luciferic and Ahrimanic. But these two currents or streams are just as much a polarity as positive and negative magnetism or electricity in the physical realm. And if we are to understand humanity and its evolution, we must try to observe how the luciferic and Ahrimanic are at work in life. Let me give one example. The structure of society was one-sidedly influenced for a long time by luciferic beings. It is not that one can eradicate the luciferic aspect from life. Someone who says they will try to guard against luciferic influence will succumb to it even more. All we can do, rather, is accord this influence its proper realm in life, knowing that the luciferic is at work in one place and the Ahrimanic in another. Then we can avoid exaggerating their effects and shedding a false light on them. For centuries, the structure of society in Europe and in other places in the world too was dominated by strong, one-sided luciferic impulses. These strong luciferic impulses engage human drives and instincts, working from within outward. This is not a critique, just a characterization of the times. How does this luciferic impulse work? Hitherto, society, its culture, and the place a person occupied within it have been shaped by people's vanity and ambition, and these are luciferic impulses. A person's vanity and ambition were invoked. I myself can recall how vanity and ambition were elicited at school not so long ago. And these impulses were often what spurred people to acquire or appropriate things that would give them an important position in society. Now, an important moment has arrived, however. A careful observer can hardly avoid seeing that these luciferic impulses are on the wane. To put it baldly, they no longer have attraction, but they are being replaced by something else, largely Ahrimanic in nature. And an Ahrimanic quality is creeping into the workings of society now. Our dear populace, free of authority, as it believes, and rejecting and attacking all imposed authority, will nevertheless blindly allow Ahrimanic impulses to shape society and its structures one-sidedly. As one example, something very strange has occurred in the form of psychological testing. Experimental psychology, which no doubt has a limited justification at universities, is capable of discovering some things about the workings of the human body and how it gives expression to various aspects of the psyche. But now it has devised something that avoids any need to study this psyche more deeply. A piece of equipment records data electrically. The length of time it takes for a student to register a particular impression is measured. Thus people are studied in an external, clinical way, and this is easier than searching within. I have no doubt of the value of this experimental psychology in particular areas, but now it is seeking to broaden its remit and to study gifted children in this way. A number of children across the age range are tested for attributes such as memory, attentiveness, and so forth. Yet the way in which the methodology of experimental psychology is used is very odd. For instance, memory is tested as follows. 2 columns of disconnected words are written on the board, such as, in quotes, head and, in quotes, crystal, followed by 2 other unconnected words, and so on. And then, having rubbed the whole thing out, just the first word in each column is written again, and the child has to remember the other word in the other column. Those who can recall the disconnected companion word for each word written down are thought to have a better memory, while others who either can't remember at all or take a longer time to do so have a worse memory. That's how powers of memory are tested. Or then they test intelligence. Let me read you an example of how they do so. Quote, for instance, if one gives words such as mirror, murderer, rescue, a whole range of diverse connections can be established between the mirror and the rescue, which require no specialized knowledge, but only a well-developed combinative capacity. The most obvious connection, close quote, Steiner again, and therefore one a less intelligent child will make, continue quote, is of course that the person threatened sees in the mirror the murderer creeping up on him. But quite different motifs can be imagined. For instance, a murderer creeping up on his victim might knock into a mirror, and the clatter caused by this could wake up the threatened sleeper so that he can save himself. Or the murderer, as he takes aim, is blinded by a reflecting mirror. Close quote, Steiner again. Just imagine, this is supposed to measure intelligence, continue quote. This can also involve motifs that elicit feelings more strongly. For instance, the murderer can get such a fright at his vague image in the mirror in the half-dark that he relinquishes his intention, either because of his sudden fear or because he feels pangs of conscience when he sees his reflection, or else because he thinks that his image in the mirror is that of somebody else, close quote, Steiner again. Apparently, it is especially intelligent if the child thinks the murderer might see his own reflection and think it is that of someone else. Quote, one might also imagine that the murderer creeping up on his victim is reflected in the clear water of a lake, in a wood, etc. Close quote, Steiner again. So, the child is supposedly more or less intelligent, depending on whether he thinks the most obvious thing or something less obvious. And anyone who is shown to be more intelligent by this means receives special educational funding. This is how intelligence is to be tested today, and people are enthusiastic about these methods. This is all meant to enhance the social order, if not actually shape and determine it. Such proposals, currently the subject of much campaigning, will be seen by the public, no doubt, as the outcome of genuine science. By this means, people attempt to find ways of according each person their, quote, rightful place, close quote, in society, and essays are written to support this end. One such begins as follows, quote, applied psychology has flourished during the war like no other discipline. This is not by chance. Consuming people as it did and making many kinds of differentiated demands, the war, after all, made clear that one should not waste human resources or fail to make properly planned use of them. Hitherto, only education has made practical use of the methods of exact psychology. But now 3 questions arise. What profession is a person best suited for? Problem of choice or profession. How can we replace the resources of intelligence that have been lost in such high numbers? Selection of talented students. And how can we best heal those suffering from head wounds and other nerve injuries? Psychotherapeutic practice. Close quote. And Steiner again. And so on and so on. This represents a very misguided outlook of our times, which generally escapes notice all the more, since there are, of course, professions where such an approach is called for, such as aircraft pilots, whose reactions and responsiveness do need testing. But such things should not be generalized, for this will introduce an Ahrimanic quality of the narrowest kind into the structure and fabric of society. Everything would be excluded from human aspirations, from human endeavors, that arises from the soul and its elementary impulsive instigation. We can see this in very crass terms. If, in quotes, talented children were really tested in this way, and the results actually implemented as proposed, what meaning could there be in the phrase, quote, love and delight are the wings of great deeds, close quote? If people stopped to think about the biographies of great figures, they would discover, of course, that someone like Helmholtz, say, would have been marked down as a very untalented chap. Just read Helmholtz's biography. This is an Ahrimanic trait at work here. These things emerge in a masked way. If people cannot observe things as spiritual science does, they fail to notice where the harm lies. It is not enough today to give way to all kinds of delightful sentiment. We have to awaken and judge life clearly. If a few people, at least, could form an objective view of this nonsense of talented pupil testing, that would be a very good thing. You can be sure that this approach will develop and thrive and will be regarded as objective and open-minded. It will be glorified as one of the finest outcomes of a philosophical school of thought which has, finally, shed all old idealistic preconceptions and methods. Connected with these things, above all, is the need for the human soul to develop fundamental qualities of breadth of interest and authenticity. Let me offer two examples here of the lack of these qualities today. Please don't be offended if I reach for examples close to hand. In Munich recently, I gave a lecture about a seer's relationship to and experiences of art. I never imagined that a newspaper reporter would be likely to understand spiritual science and to write anything worthwhile about it. On the contrary, if this were to happen, I would be greatly surprised. In this lecture, I was speaking about the art of music and the fact that musical experience encompasses our whole being in important ways, and that in all real musical experience, a rhythm develops and unfolds within us. Then I spoke both about the human soul and spirit and about physiological aspects, mentioning how the cerebrospinal fluid rises and falls through the subarachnoid cavity, and showing furthermore that the spinal column is more or less flexible and extendable, giving rise to a wonderful inner rhythm. Through musical experience, something magnificently rhythmic occurs in us. I mentioned this rhythmic flux of the cerebrospinal fluid, which I also associated with in-breath and out-breath. And since I was also speaking of symbolic ideas in this lecture, the newspaper reporter stated that I used inappropriate symbolic ideas, such as the idea of the cerebrospinal fluid. Yet we need only realize that the brain without the cerebrospinal fluid would weigh down upon the underlying blood vessels and crush them. The Archimedes principle means that the brain is rendered lighter by the cerebrospinal fluid. It is something perfectly real, not just symbolic. But that is the scope of people's interests nowadays, and such nonsense is written. And then, one more example, a tiny one really, of authenticity and inauthenticity. I have often mentioned that the somewhat dubious academic Max Dessoir also wrote a chapter on anthroposophy in his book titled Beyond the Soul. I have made efforts to point out his errors and distortions, but in purely external ways too his approach is very comic and utterly superficial. Citing my book titled The Philosophy of Freedom, he says that this was my first venture into authorship. I had to correct him and point out that I had been writing and publishing books for 10 years before this. Yet Dessoir's Beyond the Soul was widely acclaimed and was discussed by journalists such as those who think cerebrospinal fluid is something symbolic. It drew popular attention, and a second edition has now been published. In his preface, Dessoir seeks to justify himself in exactly the same distorted ways, saying that it is quite clear from the context that I have failed to understand him. He meant that the Philosophy of Freedom was my first theosophical book. Well, apart from the fact that it is clearly ridiculous to think he can be referring to anything other than my first book, it is just as ridiculous to speak of the Philosophy of Freedom as my first theosophical work, given that many people have said that I put philosophy behind me when I embarked on my theosophical books. This lack of truthfulness is something we have to get to grips with. We won't make any headway without authenticity, and we cannot let such things go unchallenged. For anyone familiar with these matters, Max Dessoir's whole book, and not only the chapter on anthroposophy, is riddled with such flaws. And yet a journal, the title Kantstudien, which regards itself as very serious and places great importance on its scholarly credentials, and I'm mentioning it because it has not taken up arms against anthroposophy, discusses this book by Dessoir from various angles as a serious academic treatise. It is very sad indeed to find that a journal of philosophy deems such a blatantly superficial book as worthy of its scholarly attentions. And one has to ask where this leaves the general reading public, who rely, despite their supposed rejection of authority, on a journal like this to inform their choice of reading. Our only option, if we have the will for this, is to found our examination of human nature on the Spirit once more. And this is something that only the science of the Spirit endeavors to do, working toward truthfulness, a broad scope of interest, lack of Philistinism, mobility of thinking, and open-mindedness. I have mentioned these things to remind us that the content of spiritual science is not the only thing of importance. The distinctive nature of spiritual scientific ideas, thoughts, and pictures affects our whole psyche, releasing it from narrow-mindedness, Philistinism, and general clumsiness. And this inevitably becomes increasingly apparent to those who give due regard to the impulses at work in spiritual science.